Addiction isn't weakness. It's what happens when the soul is starving and no one notices. This video is not about discipline. It's about pain. We'll uncover why your compulsions aren't about pleasure, but about survival, why Carl Jung called addiction a spiritual cry for wholeness, and why Gabor Maté insists the real question isn't why the addiction, but why the pain. If you've tried everything but still feel empty, maybe it's not you that's broken, maybe it's the way you've been told to heal. Let's begin. Carl Jung, one of the deepest and most insightful thinkers in the study of the human psyche, believed that what we often label as vices are not simply reckless behaviors or moral failures, but urgent, unconscious attempts to reconnect with something sacred that was lost. In his now famous letter to the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Jung described addiction not as weakness, but as a spiritual emergency, a longing for transcendence that gets misdirected into substances, chaos, and excess. The soul, starved of meaning and unable to reach the divine, grabs for anything that offers temporary escape. He called this inner war spiritus contra spiritum, the true spirit in battle with the false one. This view is echoed by Dr. Gabor Maté, a physician and trauma expert whose life's work has been dedicated to the study of addiction and human suffering. Maté reframes the question entirely. The issue isn't why the addiction, he says. It's why the pain. In his eyes, addiction is not the root problem, it's a survival mechanism, a coping response to wounds that were never seen, never held, and never healed. And if you're willing to look inward, even briefly, you may recognize this too, that what keeps dragging you back into the same cycles isn't desire, but the need to numb. Not indulgence, but anesthesia. Most addictions aren't about seeking pleasure, they're about fleeing pain. Pain that was buried early, often before you had language to express it. In Buddhist philosophy, there's a haunting metaphor for this endless hunger, the realm of hungry ghosts, beings with tiny mouths and enormous bellies, condemned to crave what they can never truly absorb. Maté borrows this image to describe the addict, not as someone greedy or out of control, but as someone desperate for connection, for presence, for peace, but unable to find it, and so turns instead to whatever offers momentary relief, even if it comes at a high cost. Maybe you've been running for years. Maybe you've tried to quit, to control, to fix, but nothing seems to stick. I won't offer you a cure. But I will tell you this, there is a path forward. And it begins not with willpower, but with understanding. Not with fighting yourself, but with learning to listen, because addiction isn't the disease. It's the symptom. And pain, far from being the end, might just be the beginning, if you're willing to hear what it's been trying to say. To understand addiction is to understand yourself. And that changes everything. Addiction doesn't begin with a substance. It begins with pain. Long before the first drink, the first pill, the first compulsive habit, there was stress in the body, neglect in the heart, and a child who learned that the world is not safe, and that their feelings would not be met. After decades of working with people society has forgotten, homeless individuals, chronic users, those written off by their families and institutions, Maté found a single thread running through all their stories. Every one of them carried deep emotional wounds. Some were abused or neglected. Others were simply unseen, unloved, disconnected. Even without obvious trauma, early emotional deprivation shaped their minds and nervous systems to survive, but not to thrive. And that's what addiction becomes, not a disease of weakness, but a brilliant adaptation in the absence of care. The addicted brain isn't broken, it's doing exactly what it was forced to learn to do, regulate pain in any way it can. When healthy connection and presence are absent, the brain turns to substitutes, drugs, food, sex, social media, status, anything that offers a fleeting dose of dopamine and the illusion of control. But when you begin to see the behavior not as the enemy, but as a signal, a map leading back to the wound, healing becomes possible. Not through punishment, but through presence. Not through resistance, but through understanding. And that shift may be the most powerful step of all. Gabor Maté describes addiction through the Buddhist image of the hungry ghosts, creatures with tiny mouths and huge stomachs, endlessly craving what they can never truly absorb. It's a haunting metaphor for the addicted soul, always consuming, never satisfied. Because what's being chased isn't the substance, it's the feeling of being whole. It's an attempt to silence the unmet needs of a child who was never truly seen. And maybe you recognize yourself in this. Maybe your compulsion is more subtle, socially acceptable, even invisible to others, but the question remains, what are you trying not to feel? While society punishes the behavior, the pain that drives it continues to grow, quiet, unseen, unresolved. That's why approaches focused only on abstinence so often fail. They treat the surface, not the source. And until that wound is acknowledged, the mind will keep searching for escape. But what if what you've been looking for out there, in the substance, the rush, the distraction, is something only found within? What if real relief comes not from numbing pain, but from finally listening to it? This is where Carl Jung's vision becomes essential. He believed that addiction wasn't merely a way to escape suffering, it was a misdirected attempt to find something sacred. A spiritual crisis disguised as self-destruction, a desperate search for transcendence that took a wrong turn. For Jung, addiction was never just a behavioral problem or a lack of willpower. It was a profound symptom of spiritual disconnection, a cry from the soul, reaching out for meaning, trying to return to a sense of inner wholeness. When trauma, repression, cultural conditioning, or loss of identity sever that connection to the self, the psyche attempts to compensate. But when it can't find healthy, symbolic forms of expression, the need reemerges in distorted forms, obsessions, compulsions, addictions. It's as if, after losing contact with their inner compass, the individual starts searching for substitutes for the sacred, often in alcohol, drugs, or any behavior that alters consciousness enough to create the illusion of depth, of peace, of meaning. This is exactly what Jung expressed in his powerful letter to Bill Wilson, co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. He explained that the craving for alcohol is, at its root, an unconscious yearning for a mystical experience, for transcendence, for union with something larger than the self. He called this spiritus contra spiritum, the true spirit in conflict with the false, a soul torn between sacred longing and destructive escape. It may sound bold, but ask yourself honestly, what does addiction offer, if not a fleeting sense of stillness, relief, euphoria, or escape? The issue is not in what the addict seeks, but in where they've been forced to look. Jung believed that every compulsion hides a valid impulse of the soul, an attempt to come back to center. But when that longing is blocked by fear, shame, trauma, or inherited beliefs, it resurfaces through the cracks as destructive behavior. It is repressed spirituality returning through the back door of the shadow. That's why, in Jung's view, healing doesn't come from abstinence alone or rational self-control. Real healing requires a return to the self, the building of a symbolic life, the integration of what's been split off. Because addiction is not just about craving, it is the story of someone who has lost their connection to the sacred within, and is trying to restore it the only way they know how, by chasing outside what has always lived inside. But this path home is blocked by a universal obstacle, the shadow, that hidden part of the psyche formed by everything we were told not to be. In Jungian terms, the shadow holds everything rejected by our families, religions, and societies: rage, desire, grief, fear, vulnerability, sexuality, ambition, and although we try to bury it, it never disappears. It simply goes underground, where it begins to act in secret, shaping thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in compulsive, often self-sabotaging ways. As Jung warned, what you do not make conscious will manifest in your life as fate. From this lens, addiction isn't a failure of strength or character, it is the voice of the shadow demanding to be seen. It is unresolved pain morphing into compulsion, repressed emotion erupting as crisis, vulnerability masked by numbness. And until this hidden part of the psyche is brought into the light, any healing will remain partial, because the true work is not in suppressing the behavior, but in reclaiming the self. Think about how many times you've repeated the same destructive behavior, even after swearing you wouldn't. How often have you sabotaged yourself, fully aware of the cost? That force pulling you in, it's not weakness or lack of discipline. It's unprocessed pain rising to the surface. And the more you suppress it, the more power it gains. Pain that has no voice doesn't disappear, it finds other ways to speak, through habits, triggers, self-betrayal. Addiction isn't the enemy, it's the signal. A pressure valve for everything your conscious mind cannot hold. A desperate attempt to maintain balance in a system that was never given the tools to regulate itself. And as long as you keep fighting the behavior without facing what fuels it, healing remains out of reach, because you're chasing the smoke while the fire still burns underneath. Real recovery begins when you stop running and turn inward, into the discomfort, the memory, the shadow. It means stepping toward the very thing you've spent your life avoiding. This descent isn't easy. It's not glamorous. It hurts. It strips away your defenses. But it frees you. Because when the shadow is integrated, when what was hidden is finally seen, it no longer controls you. It becomes part of your strength. Not something to fear, but something to learn from. That shadow holds the imprint of trauma, unresolved childhood pain, and early emotional wounds that continue to shape your choices, even if you don't remember them. These experiences write themselves into the nervous system. They shape how you relate to love, to danger, to yourself. And until they are felt, they are fated to repeat. Before the addiction, there was abandonment. Before the compulsion, there was absence. Before the substance, there was pain, wordless, buried, screaming through the body in silence. And that's where we begin, not with the behavior, but with the wound. Because no one is born addicted. Addiction is an adaptation, a creative, intelligent response to a reality too painful to bear. It is the psyche's last resort to self-regulate in a world that never taught it how. As Gabor Maté says, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. And most addicted individuals aren't chasing pleasure, they're seeking relief. Relief from loneliness, from shame, from the invisible ache of not feeling safe, not being enough, not being held. And this pain doesn't start in adulthood. It begins in childhood, often long before we have words for it. Neuroscience confirms what many intuitively know: our earliest emotional environments shape our developing brain. If we grow up with attunement and care, we learn safety. But if we grow up in emotional coldness, chaos, or neglect, our nervous system adapts, for survival, not for peace. And for many, that adaptation becomes addiction. The child doesn't just learn that the world is unsafe, it learns its pain doesn't matter. And trauma isn't always loud. It isn't always bruises and screaming. Sometimes it's the quiet, devastating absence of what should have been there. Trauma is what happens inside you when your emotional needs go unmet and you're left to carry what no child should carry alone. That's where addiction begins, not as a chase for pleasure, but as an effort to soothe what was never soothed. It becomes an emotional prosthesis, a substitute for safety, love, and presence. It offers temporary relief, a sense of control, a moment of calm, a borrowed peace. But it's a fragile peace, and it always comes at a growing cost. The body remembers what the mind forgets: the tension, the abandonment, the deep feeling of being unworthy of love. That's why true healing cannot happen through intellect alone. The body must be involved, because the body is where the wound lives. Addiction, then, is not a failure. It is a survival strategy, a desperate act of self-preservation in a world that did not nurture your pain. And when you truly begin to see it for what it is, guilt begins to soften. Shame loses its grip. Compassion becomes possible, not as a performance, but as truth. But understanding alone is not enough. Recovery demands confrontation. It asks you to descend into what you feared the most. To face what has been buried for years. To walk into the dark and stay there long enough for your eyes to adjust. As Jung said, no tree grows to the sky without its roots touching hell. Healing is not a clean upward climb. It's a descent into the forgotten places, the silenced memories, the parts of you that were never allowed to speak. And it is in that descent, not in perfection, but in presence, that transformation becomes possible. Because real recovery isn't about willpower or quick fixes. It's about going to where the wound lives, and finally learning to meet yourself there. Healing begins the moment a person stops running and dares to face what hurts, when they finally realize that the hunger, the emptiness, the endless seeking won't be filled by another dose, another scroll, another distraction, but only begins to fade when the pain is truly heard. To descend into that pain is an act of courage. It means facing the shadow without disguise, sitting with discomfort, guilt, and shame, and enduring the rawness of being fully present with oneself. It's not fast, not easy, often lonely, but it's real, and it's necessary. This path requires a shift, from trying to conquer addiction as an enemy to understanding it as a messenger, a distorted signal pointing to where the wound lives. The very behavior that seems to destroy is also what reveals what must be healed. And this journey isn't just psychological, it's spiritual. Because addiction is, at its core, a crisis of meaning, a failed attempt to return to something sacred. The addict is often someone cut off from their center, silently searching for a way back home. Recovery, then, isn't simply about stopping the behavior, it's about becoming whole again, reclaiming what was abandoned, learning to live in the body with presence. But this return is only possible when we stop avoiding the pain and begin to walk through it, in silence, beyond illusion, into truth. To heal, we must let the old identity fall away, not to become someone fixed, but someone whole, someone no longer defined by escape, someone able to stay. This transformation doesn't happen in a moment, it's built gradually, through awareness, support, and the courage to stay with what is real. And it begins with one essential truth: you are not broken, just disconnected, not bad, but wounded, not alone, only human, trying to come home. In this final part, we'll return to the heart of the journey, what it truly means to be free. Not perfection, not constant control, but the quiet clarity that comes when pain is no longer something to escape, but something you can sit with. When the shadow is no longer feared, but integrated. When the search turns inward, and finally, homeward. Recovery is so often misunderstood. We're told it's about willpower, positive thinking, or breaking habits, but that's an illusion. Healing isn't about rising above the darkness. It's about descending into what's been buried, into the pain, the silence, the parts of you you've tried to forget. As Jung said, no tree grows to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. And for the addict, that descent is not symbolic, it's real. It's in the body, in the memories, in the unconscious where the original wounds still shape every decision. True recovery isn't just about quitting a substance. It's about ending the internal agreement with the lie that says you need to numb yourself to survive. That lie has kept you disconnected from your own life, from your own truth. Maybe for years, you believed there was no way out. That the pain was stronger than you. And in a way, it was, because it came from before you had words to fight it, the child who wasn't seen, the teen who was silenced, the adult who learned to pretend. But maybe now you're beginning to see your pain for what it is, not weakness, but signal. Not shame, but a quiet call to return to yourself. You are not your addiction. You are not your past. You are the one who sees it all, and who, step by step, is learning to choose differently. That awareness doesn't come from force. It comes when the numbing stops working. When the emptiness can no longer be filled. When silence becomes something you can finally sit inside, not with fear, but with presence. Jung reminds us, the soul doesn't seek perfection, it seeks wholeness. And that means healing doesn't require you to erase your darkness, but to bring it into the light, to witness it, to include it as part of who you are. If you've made it here, it's because something in you is done running. Something in you wants to return, to truth, to clarity, to self. And even if you don't fully see it yet, something in you has already begun to shift. This journey is not fast. It's not loud. It takes patience, humility, and the kind of courage that shows up in small, honest moments. But it is possible. And more than anything, it's worth it. If something in you stirred while watching, if even for a moment you felt less alone, leave a comment and share what stayed with you. Your voice matters here. And if you're ready to keep exploring, the next video isn't just a continuation, it's a step further into yourself. Share this with someone who needs it, subscribe if you haven't, and remember, this isn't about content, it's about coming home. One layer at a time.